Well, hello everybody. It's so good to be with you today. Um, I can't help giggling at the moment because I've been talking to Sir John Jones for the last few minutes, and he said to me just a moment ago, "I thought we were making the podcast already." And so it's really, really good to be with you. I'm Neil Hawkes, the founder of the IVIT Foundation, and I'm the host of these wonderful podcasts. They're wonderful not because of me, but because of the guests I have. And I'm so delighted. I can't tell you how delighted I am today to have a dear friend of mine, someone I've really truly admired for many years. In fact, we've shared stages together, and I always say, I'm not going on first. I'm not going on last. I'm going to put John Jones first because John is absolutely wonderful. Sir John Jones is known as an inspirational speaker worldwide. He's got a background which I'm not going to go into at the moment because I want him to tell you about it in a few minutes. So I'm not going to say too much. But in 2003, he was knighted by Her Majesty for services to education. And by gosh, doesn't Sir John Jones deserve such recognition? So without any more ado from me, hi, John. Nice to see you today.
Oh, thank you, Neil. I wish my mum could hear that. That was
By the
lovely.
way, in deference to you, is it all right if I call you John
Of
and not
course it,
Sir John?
of course it is, Neil.
Oh, good. That's good. Because I don't want to offend protocol or have a listener get in touch with me saying, Neil, you were not deferential enough. Why weren't you bowing and scraping a bit more?
Shall
Anyway, John,
report you to the Royal Society of Knights Bachelor, and they will come for you, Neil.
that would be good. There's a part of me that's really jealous of you in that way. I'm joking, of course. Um, John, can you tell us a little bit? First of all, I'd love to know about your beginnings. Where did it all start? Were you born and all that sort of stuff?
Oh, wow. Well, I was actually born. This is really, I find this fascinating because Sir Ken Robinson was a good mate of mine. The legend, and he
Mm.
truly is a legend. The word is used loosely, I think, these days, but he was a legend, Sir Ken. And he was born in 1950, and so was I. And he was born in the maternity hospital that I was born in. And he was a mad Everton fan, just like me. And when we suddenly we were talking one night over a glass of beer, and it just that was my story. That I was proud because both of us were really pleased that when you were born in this maternity hospital in Everton, not in Liverpool, Everton is an area of Liverpool, that you get Everton stamped on your birth certificate. And so we both had, I think, Everton stamped. I still got it on my birth certificate. And we always say that Evertonians are born, not made. They don't choose, they're chosen. And so we were so proud that we were born in Everton. But of course, Everton was right in the middle of Liverpool and got completely, um, well, basically destroyed in the Blitz, the Liverpool Blitz. So what they did in the late 40s, early 1950s, they shipped us all out into new towns. And one of those was a place called Kirby. And that's where I grew up. So I was born in Everton in Liverpool. And when I was about 18 months old, 2 years old, we were shifted out to Kirby. And it was strange because I mean, it was the big council estates then, which were the latest thing. The trouble is, they built all the houses without any shops or any facilities. So you had things like the van would come around with all the groceries and stuff in to buy. Um, and the bookmakers was round the garages at the back. So I would take my dad's bets around and so on. So I lived a very happy life. Although Kirby does get a bad reputation sometimes in the press, it was a wonderful place to grow up in because it was truly comprehensive. You had all walks of life there. And I remember never once feeling frightened of going out in the dark or, being out late. And we would just go out as kids and we wouldn't see our parents until, sun had gone down because we were hungry and we'd come home. We'd play test match cricket on the road and not a car would go past. So that was the kind of upbringing I had. And then tragically, my dad was my hero. He took me to my first Everton game in 1958. And I stood amongst 50, 60,000 people and a goal was scored. And I couldn't believe it. And from that moment, I was transfixed with football. So I'm a mad football fan. And I'm really pleased to say now I'm the chair of the Trust Board of Everton in the community, which is the charity of the club. And I'm also chair of governors of the Everton Free School and Football College, which I'll probably tell you a little bit more about later. But my dad, who'd fought in the jungles against the Japanese, and was a merchant seaman, and he was the army boxing champion, and he died when I was 9 years old. So he left my mum and my brother and myself, our Tom and myself, with no money really. I mean, we were in real poverty. I mean, my mum made sure it never felt like that. But I do remember going down in the mornings and I'd say, Mum, on the doormat, there was money. I said, the money fairy's been again. And I later discovered that when the other women in the street had won on the bingo in the Catholic club around the corner, they'd put some money through our letterbox because they knew mum was on her own, with two boys to feed. And I thought, how lovely, that community again that we talked about earlier, Neil. So I was lost. Because I was a Catholic, they didn't allow children to go to the funeral. So there was no such thing as closure. They didn't really understand grievance in those days. So the next day, I was on a boat going over to Ireland because I'm 53% Irish, I now have discovered on my DNA. So the Irish family took my brother and me. We went over with my grandmother, and my mum joined us later. So and the reason I tell you that is when I got back, that was in July. It was July the 29th. No, it was June the 29th, St. Peter and Paul's Day. And so the whole of the summer holiday we spent in Ireland. And then I came back in September. But I pretended that my dad hadn't died, that somehow in my head he'd gone away to sea again. And because he used to go away to sea to some amazing places and be away for months. So I convinced myself almost that he hadn't died. And a Catholic priest, Father Kevin Finn, who is my hero, took me under his arm really, and he said to me, he realised that I wasn't admitting that my dad had died, and rather than confront me with this, he just started to say things like, "John, do you want to be in the choir?" And I would say, "Over my dead body, Father, do I want to be in a choir?" It wasn't the kind of street kid activity. He said, "Okay, well, do you want to be an altar boy?" And I said, "What, you want me to wear one of those dresses that the altar boys wear?" And I remember him saying, Big Ray is an altar boy. Now, Big Ray was the best footballer. And I said, "Big Ray's an altar boy. You joke?" He said, "Yeah, he is. I said, "Okay, go on, I'll give it a go then." So that moment, a bit like your moment, when somebody discovered that acting genius in you, from that moment, it started to change my life because he then persuaded me to join the choir. Because I was an altar boy, I had to learn Latin. So these 9-year-old boys, we could all speak Latin. And when you think about it, our literacy levels were really low, but we could all speak Latin. So, and then he introduced us to 4-part harmony and common chant and And then one day he said, we're going into town. Now, very few of us have been into town, into the city, to see the Vienna Boys Choir. And I was transfixed that these boys stood around a piano singing in four-part harmony. And he introduced us to acting. We used to put plays on for the parents and do all sorts of things. And I remember through the choir, I met Brian. Now, Brian was, you see, let me shoot forward to, I wrote a master's course that I delivered at Liverpool University about leadership, but I came across Hart and Risley's research. Have you come across that? You know, the old notion that by the age of, if you're born to a professional family, by the age of 4, you get about 40 to 50 million words. If you're
Yes.
a child on benefit, which I was, you get
Yeah.
12 million. So
Yeah.
and Hart and Risley called it the early catastrophe.
Mm.
And but it was also, they looked at things like encouragement. So if you're born to a professional family, you get something like 12 encouragements to every one discouragement. If you're on benefit, you get twice as many discouragements as you do encouragements. So not only does it affect your literacy levels, but it also affects your self-confidence and your self-belief and your aspiration. Well, what Father Finn did is he suddenly started to introduce us to those things. And and this is probably the first time, your word, values, that I really got to grips with values. You see, he taught me something called warmth. You know, he was such a warm human. He opened up all the schools at the weekend, and because they were closed, and the kids had nowhere to go, so he personally opened them all, and he started paying some teachers to come back, you know, to play with us and to put the gym on and swimming pools, and so he taught us warmth. He taught me worth. You know, this idea that that you're worth something, that you are worthy. Um, he gave me the words. He made me pal up with Brian. Brian lived on the other side of town, but he was an altar boy and he was in the choir. He was the only boy I knew growing up who owned his own house, you know, because we all lived in council houses. But he owned his own house. His dad was on the council. I think his mum was a teacher. And Brian used words. And we used to say, Brian, go on, give us a word. And he'd go, obfuscate. And I go, oh, that's brilliant. Give us another one, you know. And he taught me disestablishmentarianism, you know, and all, and he knew all these words. He's the kind of kid we say we used to throw stones at, you know. But he was a cub, and I could never be in the Cubs because I couldn't afford the uniform. So I was envious of him. But he was such an inspiration. My mum didn't say, are you going to Brian's? If I was going out for the day, she'd say, are you going to the library? Because he had books. We had no books in our house. Um, and that's still, you know, there is still quite a number of kids nationally who don't have a book in the house. Well, I was one of those kids. He had a room full of books. So I got stuck into Oliver Twist and Black Beauty and all those things. Anyway, the reason I tell you all of that is because one day Father Finn asked me what I wanted to do. And I said, I think I want to be a priest, Father. Now, I didn't want to be a priest. I wanted to be Father Finn. I wanted to be like him because he'd given me the words. He'd given me the warmth. He'd given me the wonder. Oh, no, I never mentioned wonder. He'd given me the words, the warmth, and the worth. But he'd also given us that wonder, you know, going to see the Vienna Boys Choir, speaking Latin, you know, and I said, what will it be like if I go to train? And he said to me, he said, you'll be able to play football every day. I said, where do I sign up? But he was, you know, so, but also he said, you'll be able to learn Greek as well as Latin. And then I said, right, what do I have to do? He said, you have to take an examination to get in because it was a boarding school, the seminary. And so I said, right. So I turned up for the exam, not knowing about Hart and Risley and the early catastrophe. And the result was I produced, I think, the worst maths results that they'd ever had in the entrance exam. And and I later realized it wasn't because I wasn't any good at maths. It was because I was being asked in this exam to turn fractions, which I'd never heard of, into percentages and percentages into fractions. And it was just, we hadn't done it. And I read that kids that in my position were about 18 months behind the rest of the country. Now, we didn't know any of this stuff at the time. I could do add ups, takeaways, multiply, divides all day, but they weren't pushing us. They weren't, they were giving us a watered down education. These poor kids from Kirby, basically. So I failed the exam miserably. I cried my eyes out. I thought, I've let my mum down. I've let my family down. And most of all, I've let Father Finn down. Anyway, I tottled off to then secondary school. And it was 2,000 all boys. It was an amazing place. I mean, it was a bit wild in places, as you can imagine, but it had a football team to die for. Most of them went on to become professional footballers. And in my class was John Conte, who became the world middleweight boxing champion, won a gold medal at the Commonwealth Games. So at sport, they excelled, these kids, we kids. Anyway, he asked me during the year, are you going to take the exam again? And I said, oh, Father, I said, I was so upset. I said, I don't know if I can put myself through that again. Anyway, I said, I'll have a think about it. And then I came back and I said to him, Father, I'll have a go. I'll have a go at it. He said, great. I shall tell the Archbishop. I remember it was Archbishop Heenan, who became a cardinal. I shall tell the Archbishop. Anyway, he came back to see me a few days later. He said, I've spoken to the Archbishop, John, and I've got good news for you. I said, what's that, Father? He said, you've passed the exam. And I said, Father, I haven't taken the exam yet. He said, no. He said, when I told the Archbishop that you were prepared to put yourself through that again, he said, we want boys like that, because they were talking about grit and something that, the Finns talk about sisu. We don't really have, it's kind of quiet relentlessness, the refusal to give up. And I didn't know anything about that at the time, but one of the things my mum and dad had instilled in me is a kind of fighting spirit. And he said, that's what they want. So you don't have to take the exam, you've passed it. So I went and I watched my life transform. But what was sad is I kept going back home to Kirby, to my mates that I'd grown up with. And I saw the deprivation that they were going through without realizing it. And what I was being presented with, I mean, we were having debating societies. When the lake froze at the college where I was, we played ice hockey. We fought ancient Greek sea battles on the boats. When the fruit was ripe and the potatoes needed picking, we did all of that on the farm. And I did Greek, I did Latin, So when I went home on the first holiday, he said, what's it like, John? I said, Father, I'm in the football team. I'm captain in the football team and I'm playing every day. He said, I told you. And I said, but most of all, I said, there are Brians everywhere. In other words, you remember my mate Brian with the words? And I was surrounded by these boys who were just amazing. And so I then got a kind of missionary zeal, not to just become a priest, but that education and the different types of education change your life. If you're lucky enough to find your place, or find yourself in the kind of place you need to be. So that drove me, because as you know, I spent most of my teaching career in challenging schools. That's where I wanted to be. In fact, I went back to Kirby to be
But
the
why
head
weren't you
teacher.
a priest, John? I thought you were training to be a priest. What
I
happened?
was, I was,
Why
and
did you get out of there?
I was once asked that at an interview for a teacher's job, and it was to be the head of French in a school. And because I did French and Latin, my degree was French and Latin. Um, and I just said, cherchez la femme in the interview. I said, well, I've never really had a girlfriend till I went to university. And so I was being prepared because you went to the seminary at 11, 12 years of age, and you were there till you were 26. But HMI, for my cohort, changed the rules in the sixth form and said you must allow these boys to experience university if they want to go. So I went from the seminary to university.
Where was that, John?
I went first of all to Bangor, Bangor University, mainly because I wanted to watch Everton every week, so I could get back from Bangor to Liverpool. The head teacher of the school, I actually applied to Liverpool, and he wouldn't let me. He said, "You need to get away from Liverpool. From Liverpool, you need to get away and be away from the culture and grow a bit." So I did, but Bangor was the next one. I didn't want to go to Manchester, so Bangor was the next one. But I ended up playing football for the university, so I didn't go to me football in the end because I was playing football all the time for the university. But what happened is at the end of university, the college, my seminary rang me up and said, "Would you like to come and take over the languages department?" Because the priest had just left who taught there. So I did. So I went back for 2 years on the staff. And so it was amazing because all the teachers who taught me, they were all priests. I was the first lay person ever to be on the staff. All the teachers who taught me were now my friends as opposed to my teachers. It was kind of spooky, it was. So I went back and it was then that I decided that this wasn't going to be for me, that actually teaching was something that I felt passionate about. And particularly I was a bit of a socialist. Well, I still am a socialist. And I was very into social injustice and how, there are haves and there are have-nots, and there are advantaged and there are disadvantaged. And our country, I do honestly believe, Neil, that I don't think racism is now the big issue it was. I think as I travel the world, and I know you do a great deal, I think our country are really getting to grips with, the issues around the challenge of racism. And I think we're doing quite well. I think snobbery is much more pernicious because it kind of undermines the whole way the British view things. There's the aristocracy they're still there. And so without being too political, when I know that only 6% of kids go to private schools, but 60% of the judiciary and the military and in medicine and so on hold down the positions of power, there's still a lot of work we have to do around real equality and equity as well. So that's what drove me really, and that was my passion to tackle social injustice in all its forms.
It's fascinating listening to you because I think listeners will have got an incredible insight into your formation as a human being in those early years, growing up in a disadvantaged area, but having opportunity and your own innate intelligence to see things and to understand and to be critically aware. Absolutely incredible. Then you became a teacher. Take us through what happened in those early years of teaching after you left the seminary. Where did you go on to, and what did you do leading up to your first headship?
Well, it was quite bizarre, really. I remember the very last lesson I taught at the seminary. So I was there for 2 years. And I suddenly realized, with my socialist hat on again, that really I'm working in a very comfortable. I mean, it was a public school by any other name, but it was comfortable, and if you like, the students were. I mean, they were teacher proof in the sense that you know, they were going to get good results.
Yeah.
Probably if I'd been average, they'd have got the same results. You know, I did all I could, obviously, to get them the best results I could, but they were motivated and switched on, and they worked. And I thought, this is not really what I want to do. So the very last lesson I taught was an A level, upper sixth lesson on existentialism. Jean Paul Sartre. It was just before their A level exams, and I'd applied to Ashton County Secondary Modern School, and I taught the very first lesson. So, if you like, the next lesson that I taught was to set 12 at Ashton County Secondary Modern School. And it was French, you know, these kids, they were just a delight, you know. I just thought, this is such a culture shift, but this is where I want to be. You know, there were kids who, you know, there was a boy, they had a colostomy bag, you know, do you want to see me bag, sir? You know, yeah, okay. I'm, oh, right. And then there's show him your scars, you know. So this lad had climbed over, you know, the overhead cables on a railway and almost barbecued himself, and he was covered in, and this was his party piece. And I just thought, I'm at home here. And I remember one of the guys that I had the first cup of coffee, he said, so you're trying to teach that crowd? He said, French. I said, yeah. I said, I'll tell you what, by the end of the month, every one of those kids will be able to count up to 30 in French. So we had a couple of quid on it, you know? And I thought, right, I've got to, it wasn't just like every single one of them had to be able to do it, you know. So what I did, I took some slides of I'd been to Paris. I used to go to Paris a lot, and I've been to Paris, and I had loads of slides of Paris. So I remember saying that, you know, I'm going to show you some slides because we're going to go on an imaginary trip to Paris. That actually caused me to be dragged into the head teacher's office because parents had rung up saying, I haven't got the money for my kid to go to Paris. Because what I realized is the word imaginary just went over their heads, you know. So they're going to Paris, you know, with Mr. Jones. You know? So I suddenly had to undo that, but not. Do you remember those carousel projectors?
Yes, indeed.
And I remember the one we had was one of the very first remote control ones. So you could stand at the back of the room and click the remote in your pocket, and the slide would change. And of course, the kids thought this was wonderful, but I didn't tell them I had this remote control. And they said, Sir, how does that change when you're over there and the machine's over here? I said, you have to speak a number in French into the little grill. You know where the air used to cool you? You have to speak French into that grill. You don't. I said, go on. I said, well, what's the word for one? And they all went, because they all knew. I said, right, what's two? Now, half of them knew two. I said, right, we've had the first slide. Who's going to do it? Johnny, come on. And he shouted, duh, into the back of the machine. Well, of course, I'm over there and I clicked the thing and it changed. Whoa, there's a queue. What's three? You know, what's so I won me money. That's how I taught them all to count to 30. If you shouted at the machine, it would change, you know.
John, I've
So
got to ask you, I'm going to interrupt. When did do you remember when your humor started? Because you've always been a real raconteur with humor and you teach with humor. Was it in those early days of schooling or was it earlier than that? When you were a teacher or earlier?
it's Liverpool Irish, Neil.
Ah,
It is. I mean, I'm not saying nobody else has a sense of humor, but particularly the cocktail of Liverpool and Irish is magical. I mean, they're lyrical. The music is lovely. You know, I mean, just listen to Irish music. You know,
yeah,
I mean, and then the Liverpool sound, the Beatles, of there's something about, and also I think because of the struggle. You know, the what was the word I came across in Chinese? Chiku is the Chinese. It means eating bitterness. And when you live a life of struggle, that you there are certain qualities that emerge, and you look at Ireland, the poetry of Ireland, and the literature and the music and they were they were a downtrodden, the British were, the history is that the British were awful to the Irish, but out of that emerged this wonderful creativity and imagination. And so I think this in fact, I carried the principle of Chico into my teaching because I think, who is it calls it, the learning pit, and I've forgotten his name, and I should credit him with it. But he says, you know what, and he got it from Eastern teaching, because what Eastern teaching does is they give you the problem and then let you try and solve it before they tell you how to solve it, and which is a wonderful way of doing things. Whereas we explain it first and then give you the problem. Now I know we're into now problem solving and we're doing less of that, but it was the fundamental difference between East and West education and learning. Um, and their notion is that you have to go through the struggle. You have to experience it, because out of that will emerge the genius we talked about
Yeah.
before, that is, as we believe, in everybody. That's the
Absolutely.
genie in the lamp, isn't it?
Mm.
We all
Mm.
have the genie in the lamp, and struggle and eating bitterness, as the Chinese say, has a kind of a potential to release that
Yeah.
genie from the lamp in a way that many other things can't. And we don't seem to still in our education system understand that.
No.
We still spoon feed kids.
Mm.
It's still fundamentally memorization. I mean, I told you I wrote and taught a master's course at Liverpool. It's only about halfway through a master's course that you're really able in our system to truly think for yourself
Yeah.
and choose what you want to do.
Mm. Mm.
It's very strange. It's called
Yeah.
a curriculum, and you're told what to do, and these are the exams you have to take.
Yeah.
And you see, my worry is, because that works for this 6% of the population, why change it? And so we've got a real struggle on our hands to
Mm.
release the genie that's in all kids. In the other 94%, it's
Was
there.
that, John, why you became a head teacher? Was it because you saw an opportunity to help shift the system?
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm.
It was, I mean, one of the first things I did when I went back to Kirby to be a head teacher. So my hometown. It was in the, it was in the school next to the school. I'd gone to a school called St. Kevin's, which was about 2,000 old boys. And next door to us was Rufford, which was, we called it the Protestant school, but it was a state school, and it was mixed. So we found that fascinating, because the Catholics were divided into St. Gregory's Girls' School and St. Kevin's Boys' School. Rufford was mixed. So we were fascinated staring, because a common fence separated us. So I went back to be the head of Rufford School. Um, and one of the first things I noticed, I remember it staggered me really, that I wanted to introduce awards, because the, there was a subculture of, it was cool not to wear uniform, not to do homework. There was that kind of subculture of, I mean, it was a rebellion really. And I thought I wanted learning to become cool. And we started to introduce award systems, but the kids wouldn't come on the stage to pick them up, because it was regarded as, you know, but over a period of about 3 or 4 years, I remember getting a letter in about year 3, maybe 3.5 years, from a parent bitterly complaining that her son had been missed out at the awards assembly. And I thought, we've changed. This flywheel now is turning, because now it was not only cool to go on stage, but if you didn't get on, people were really complaining, why am I not up there? So we knew we were shifting that culture. So it's, what we did, we Panorama did a documentary where Roughwood School, this was before I arrived as head, had been linked and done an exchange with Rugby School. And so what I did when I got there, I resurrected these links. It was a few years before, but I said, wouldn't it be great if we took the kids down to Rugby School and recreated that? Because what I wanted to do was to get our kids to see how the other half lived. And so off we tootled down to Rugby School, and it was amazing. It was amazing. And I remember on the journey home on the bus, we were talking about the effect that it had had, and one of the kids said, "Do you know what, sir? They're just like we are." And I said, "Of course they're just like we. You think we'd be in the zoo, you know?" I said, "Of course they're just like we are." Um, and they said, "We're as good as they are, aren't we?" I said, "Yeah, of course we are." And then one of the boys said, "Nah, sir." He said, "There's a big difference." I said, "What is it?" He said, "They've got dinero, money." "They've got dinero, sir," in his Scouse accent.
Yeah.
And I said, "You're right there. You're dead right there." I said, "So what have we got to do to achieve what they've achieved?" He said, "We've got to graft, haven't we, sir? That's what we've got to do." And one of the girls said, I remember Nikki said, "Is that what you mean by social injustice in your assemblies, sir?" I said, "That's exactly what I mean. It's not fair that they just get it. They're lucky. We've got to work so hard to achieve what they've got." And I remember saying, shouting on the bus, "Are we up for it?" And they all went, "Yeah." You know, and I thought, that's the mission achieved. So then we took them to New College, Oxford, Neil. We took them for dinner because we had a link at New College, Oxford. One of our staff had been a student there, so we took them for dinner. Now you're Oxbridge, aren't you? So
Yeah, I got in the back door. So
well, those lovely, the oak panel doors that you step
yeah,
into this other world.
yeah.
And to be honest, we went for dinner, and I aged 10 years. Solid silver cutlery. My goodness me! I thought a knife and fork would be life changing for somebody's kid. And I lined them up. I said, "Right, no bags, no coats. I've counted every knife and every fork." But anyway, they were all laughing at that. And then there was this lad who was one of the most able students I'd come across, and I talked to him about this thing called university, and he'd never heard of a university. Uh, and I said, "Well, look, I was the first child in my family to go to university, and it changed my life, and I kept on, but he didn't want to do it. He didn't, and he's from a very tough background." And I remember during the meal, I was just walking around as they were all chatting, and I just said to him, I think I'll call him JB. I said, "JB." Oh no, he called me over. He called me over. He said, Sir, can I have a word?" I said, "Yeah, what is it, JB?" And he put his arm out like this around the oak panels and all the regalia and the paintings. And he said, is this what you meant by university? I said, "Yeah, what do you think, mate?" And he put his hand there so nobody could hear him. He said, "It's fantastic. I want this." And he went. But you
Wow.
see, what I always said is our kids, you can't tell them about it. They have to touch it and taste it and smell it. You've got to take them there. And of course, great thing then, we also then did, the Houses of Parliament, there's a balcony at the back where the great and the good have their meals.
Yeah.
Well, George Howarth, God bless him, our MP for Knowsley, he got us down there to have some food on the balcony. And I remember Seb Coe was there, and it was like, wow, and it was just amazing. So that was the kind of thing that we started to do because we wanted to just raise their aspiration. And that young woman called Nikki, Nicky's a barrister now. And at the Everton School and Football College, when I'm chair of governors, I rang her up and said, have you got any time to be a governor, Nicky? And she became a governor at the school.
Oh,
She
wow.
gave me 4 years. Isn't it a
Wow.
lovely kind of circular
Yeah.
story where it ends up with her as a barrister and being a governor at our
Can
school?
I take you on now after your two headships in tough schools? You then went into a not so tough school. What was the motivation for that, John?
Um, it, it, it was the sixth form, really.
Ah,
I'd only ever taught in 11 to 16 schools and loved it. I absolutely loved it. What I just thought for my own experience, just to get the whole kind of spectrum of it, I just wanted to be in a school with a big, thriving sixth form. And that was the attraction. And that was the main reason that I went there. But you know what? I'll tell you this, Neil. It was a lovely school, but I always felt when I went there, so I'm not going to name it, but I always felt it was cruising. Before Ofsted invented that term, it was chugging along, doing okay, but it had such potential.
mm,
Roughwood, when the very first league tables came out, Roughwood was part of Knowsley. Knowsley vied with people like Tower Hamlets to stay away from the bottom of the National League tables because if you were second from bottom, the heat was far less intense than if you were bottom. And I remember when Knowsley finished bottom and we finished bottom of Knowsley, that we had the media outside, national media, wanting to speak to the head of the worst school in the country.
mm,
It was a bad time. It was during my early days in Kirby. It was a bad time. But it was, I always say, the challenge of getting the staff on board in that context. The staff at Roughwood were amazing.
mm,
Um, and to change that school around was far easier as a leader than to go to a school that was satisfied with itself and was doing okay and was oversubscribed and so on, but could do so much more. That was a tougher journey.
mm.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. Similar experiences to me on that one. But then you were enticed. I think, I don't know if enticed is the right word, but you were enticed by the government to go and do great and good things away from your headship. Tell us a little bit about that next stage of your journey.
Yeah, it came about with. Do you remember the Excellence in Cities project?
Yes.
Which was just, I mean, to me, it was magical, really. Um, it was focusing and concentrating on, what I call the have-nots and the disadvantaged. For probably for really the first time ever, lots of money was coming in to try and raise the aspirations of these kids who've been disadvantaged for so long. So I got involved in the Excellence in Cities project. And then I got kind of sidetracked into neighborhood renewal, which I really enjoyed because it was holistic. The school, I believed, could be a real catalyst
Mm,
for growth and renewal and transformation. But it had to be in terms of the neighborhood and the community. So I really got into community education then, and that schools should never close. And that, particularly in very challenging areas, the school could be a real beacon for everything because then we were setting up victim support in schools and all sorts of different societal issues would be being focused in the schools. So I mean, I loved all of that. My only regret about it was that we did have what was called a gifted and talented project. If you remember, because the government was very concerned
yeah.
about the fact that there was a drainage, if you like. I mean, I remember when in Roughwood when we started to really succeed, getting calls from the private schools because they wanted our best kids. And almost it was kind of patronizing. They felt like they were doing us a favor by taking, but we needed those kids, in terms of the culture of the school. I wanted the whole spectrum of ambition and achievement in the school. And if you chop off one end of it, then it starts to change. Culture is, Jared Egan said, the way we do things around here, and you have to have that right mix of people, don't you? And it was skewing it one way, and I was worried about that. So we started gifted and talented programs to stop the hemorrhaging, and it worked. Where it didn't work was that I mean, I'm not saying that there aren't very able kids and further down the ability spectrum and performance spectrum, but the notion of gifted and talented is so fixed, and it certainly is only applied to a few. And it worried me because of our notion of genius.
Yeah.
I come from the classical school where genius was within everybody. And if you read Homer, if you read Virgil, the first couple of lines of their great works, they would call upon the muse to help them, because they knew without the muse, they couldn't show the genius. The genius had to come and visit them. And they accepted that today it might be with me, tomorrow it might be gone. But I would always keep waiting and working and striving. And I love that notion of genius. And then suddenly in the Renaissance, I mean, fundamentally, I think because the church fell out with the politicians, and this whole idea of God and the spiritual and the spirits and the muses, they debunked it, and it was about it was innate ability, but only in a few. And that became the definition of genius. And that was such a sad point in history in terms of the way we view achievement and ability. So well, how did I get onto genius? And oh yeah, you talked about the broader work that I started to do, about neighborhood renewal, about I used to worry that. I remember in Kirby, they spent a lot of money fixing everybody's roofs, and nobody noticed. And I said, you know what? I've got this sinking feeling, and I'm still struggling with this principle. Would it have been better to go to a small area and make it amazing? And everybody could see what is possible, and then everybody would want it and would fight for it. But if you fix everybody's roof, nobody noticed. Where's the money gone? Well, it's everybody's roof. The roofs don't leak anymore. Yeah, but it hasn't raised aspiration.
Yeah.
So I always struggled with those tensions. And that
Mm.
was as a result of moving just out of the school into looking at social transformation, and trying to change whole communities. And how do you do it?
John, was this about the time when you started to think, John, I think I should start going out as a speaker and to see what I can do to sow seeds in others? Because you then started at the same time being very well known around the country and then internationally as this amazing speaker that you are. Uh, was that the time when all this started and the reasons for it?
No, do you know what? Somebody said that you get promoted in teaching because you're good at something else. And it's actually true. And it's a process of leaving the classroom, which is one of life's tragedies in a way, isn't it? The
Yeah.
best teachers end up out of the classroom. But anyway, that's another point. I was asked to do a talk. And I remembered it was a February night. It was freezing. It was miserable. I'd had a really tough day in school. And somebody had asked me to go to this primary school in Toxteth, um, to do a little talk about some of my work that I was doing in Kirby. And I thought, I do not need this. But I thought, no, I'm going to do it now. But at that time, I was playing in a duo at the weekends. I was earning as much money playing in the duo as I was teaching. I always say I took a vow of poverty and became a teacher, but I was playing in a duo, and our rule was 1 week you could be playing in front of 1,000 people in a wonderful cabaret club, and next week the agent had put you in a pub with a man and a dog, and but you gave the same performance, and that's what you had to do. So I thought, no, the principal. I'm going to be in this little primary classroom. There's going to be, I asked how many were there. They said there're going to be about 8 people there. And they'll be sitting on, those little infant chairs, and I've got to do this. Anyway, um, I did the talk and I really enjoyed it. And they were a great group of people. And one of them was a police officer. And he said to me, we've got a police conference in somewhere near Preston, and I'd like you to come and do that talk for the police. So I said, yeah, okay. So I tip up to this other thing, and there were about 200 police officers in it. And I suddenly thought, whoa, I was really nervous then. So it was a big step up from the 8. So I did my talk there. And there was a guy, was it Nigel? What was Nigel's second name? He ran. Do you remember Victim Support? There was
Yeah.
a national organization called
Mm.
Victim Support. And he was at that conference, or one of his leaders was at the conference. And they came up to me and said, would you like to come down to London, to the Hilton Hotel, and do that talk for our audience down there, which won't just be police officers, it'll be all sorts of people. It's a victim support conference, blah, 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 blah. So I said, yeah, I will do it. I said, as long as I can bring some of my students with me, because I knew it was being presented then by the Channel 4 news presenter, whose name escapes me. But it was kind of a big deal. It was televised, and I knew there were going to be something like 700-800 people at this. And I just wanted to see my kids walking up into the Hilton Hotel, with the commissioner and all that stuff. I just wanted them to experience it. And what was lovely is when I was doing the talk, he stopped me, the news guy. He said, John, can I just stop you for a second? You have some of your students here, don't you? I said, yes, I do. They're all sitting there. They were in the middle, all in their green blazers. And he said, can I ask them to stand up, please? And they stood up, and hundreds of people cheered and clapped them. And I was in tears, and I thought, that will transform you. You remember those W's I said that Father Finn gave me? That's wonder, isn't it? Not only is it worth, it's wonder, and they're two of their values to me. And so suddenly I was a speaker. It happened in about a month. So I didn't plan it. I just suddenly thought, I'm not bad at this. People seem to like it.
An
And
understatement.
the audience is suddenly getting bigger. And as you remember, we met, didn't we, at a conference?
Yes.
We did, down in Oxford.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
How
And
many years ago is that, Neil? That's a while back.
it's 20 years ago, I think, if not more.
It
And
might
then we were in where was it in Belfast? We sat and had a pint in
be. It
opposite the most bombed hotel in Northern Ireland, where we were sleeping.
We did,
And
we did,
yeah,
we did.
yeah, absolutely amazing time.
Brilliant,
So
brilliant.
yeah, John, what's your formula for good speaking? You have a formula, I think, which you always remember, and I think anybody who's listening to you on this podcast would be fascinated to know if they want to be a good speaker, what they would need to do. What's your formula, John?
Well, it's three things really. I think if you're bold enough to stand up and speak in public, do you know that's the number one fear for human beings?
Hmm.
Death is number two, apparently. So it's a big challenge, but quite a few people want to do it now. That you have to entertain, you have to inform, and you have to inspire. And I always ask people, what is the most important of the three? And they always make the mistake of inform is the most important. And that translates into boring talks, usually, because what holds the whole thing together is the ability to tell stories.
Yes.
You've got to be able to tell stories. Um, that's why, do you know, I love the internet. I read a great article not long ago called Campfires in Cyberspace, because people gather now, you know, in chat rooms. And
Mm.
it's like the old campfire, because learning was done around the campfire, and the elders would sit and would tell stories, and the children would gather and families would gather. And then now and again, a traveling merchant would join them and then give some more insights. And I just love the idea of campfires in cyberspace. And that's rooted in good storytelling. But if you can make people laugh and you can make people cry, and you will glue the information into their heads,
Yeah.
because it's inevitable. But if you just give them information, well, they'll fall asleep
Yeah.
after. They reckon it's about 3 or 4 minutes, don't they, before your brain switches into something more
What do
interesting.
you think we should do with the education system to sort of gear it up as it should be now in the 21st century? You you know fought for social democracy all your life, and uh, where should we go now?
We've got to wrestle the exam beast to the ground. It is so inadequate. This idea that you sit kids in a room so many meters apart, and then you hand out a paper and you say, you may now open the paper, you know, and then hope that they've remembered enough of what you've poured into them over the last 2 or 3 years, and they regurgitate it, is absurd. I mean, it is fundamentally absurd, especially when we have now the most amazing brain called Google. I mean, Google is amazing. It's global brain. You don't need to carry stuff anymore. It's at their fingertips, isn't it? So I think we have to wrestle the exam beast to the ground for sure. Um, by the way, I was in a class. This happened to Ian Gilbert, and it happened to me. A student put his hand up and said, "Sir, why do I need a teacher when I've got Google?" And and of course, being the teacher, I know our job is not to answer questions. Our job is just to comment on really good ones. So I just said, "Brilliant question," and then shut up. It's called let the silence do the lifting and the learning.
Yeah.
So I just said, "Great question." And then he looked at me and he said, "Teachers are stupid." Now, I know the rules of behavior management. They lie in the smiling eyes of the teacher
Thank you.
and the ability to be an actor, not a reactor. So I
Yeah.
stayed calm and I smiled. I said, "Well, I am a teacher. Would you like to develop that point?" He said, "Yeah, teachers are the only people on the planet who ask you a question to which they already know the answer." He said, "That's stupid." And you know, Neil, break it down. When you think about it, it's
Absolutely. Yeah.
absurd, isn't it? Imagine walking down the road tonight and saying, "Excuse me, can you tell me where the Red Lion pub is, please?" And then the guy goes, "Yeah, it's second on the left." And you go, "I know, well done." Give yourself a pat on the back. They'd send for an ambulance, wouldn't they? But
Yeah.
even now, in every school in the country, certainly, it's happening.
Mm.
Anyway, I refused to answer the question. And then Sarah put her hand up. Remember this young girl called Sarah? And she said, "Sir, you're struggling with the Google question, aren't you?" And I think deep humility is a key characteristic in good teaching. Even if you know, pretend not to know.
Yeah.
It's empowering, isn't it? So I just said, "Sarah, I am struggling. Can you help me?" She said, "Yes." She said, "I think so." She said, "You see, I'm going to go to university to study history because Mrs. Smith didn't teach me history. She taught me the love of history." And I think Google can teach you history all day long. It just can't give you the love of history. That's
Oh,
Mrs. Smith's job, and
that's
that's our
beautiful.
job. And
That's
you know,
beautiful.
when you look at now, was it that research came out of Oxford a few years ago saying that I think then it was in the next 25 to 30 years that about 40% of the jobs that we know
Mm.
will be gone. And you look at now the implications of AI. I mean, really, what we should be focusing on to me is that what AI can't deliver, and you and I were talking about this, weren't we, just
Yeah.
before, but things like social interaction, absolutely huge. Empathy, the ability to be empathic. That's why I can never watch The Apprentice. You know, he drives me up the wall. And what we're supposed to be teaching our kids, and this is what good leadership is like, that you're rude to people and brutal. And it just, so I'm worried about empathy, um, things, creativity and imagination.
Mm.
Now, whenever I go into school, that's what I'm looking for. Where are they developing those skills? Because that's the only way we can fit our kids for the 21st century and for the challenges of all those things that we're going to face. And the good news is, you know, people are now talking, and I've talked about this for years, the 4-day working week. People are talking about it now seriously. You know, poor
Mm.
old Jeremy Corbyn, and I wasn't a fan of his, but he talked about this in his manifesto. And I remember on Question Time, somebody raised it, one of the Labour candidates, one of his candidates raised it, and the audience mocked this person. And I'm thinking, why aren't you cheering and clapping?
Yeah.
Because, you know, a 4-day working week will release us, you know, to develop our social interaction, our empathy, our creativity, our imagination. Because sadly, the statistics from the world of work are that most people are unhappy in their place of work. And that saddens me greatly.
It is very sad. John, I can't let you go because uh, listeners may not know that you are a patron of values-based education and IVIT, the parent charity of values-based education. You are someone who, you know, lives and breathes values. Uh, what's your take on values? Why are they important to you?
Wow. The the clever answer is that they give you a real sense of moral purpose. You know, I have a, you know, I did, I'm not doing a plug for the book, but I've written a book called Dusting Off Thunderbolts. And it's a long story about the title, which I won't bore you with. But I talk about my muses. I talked about the ancients and their
Mm.
notion of genius and so on, as we talked about before. And so what I did is I've been guided by muses. And and one of them, and they're ones that I picked up from around the world. So one of them is Ikigai, which I picked up when I was working in Japan, which is the reason that I get out of bed in the morning. And it's huge in the Japanese culture. And unless you have a purpose, then you won't live a happy, successful life. And yet their purpose is very simple things, the way they eat, the way they communicate, and so on. You know, so there's a value to me that you have to have a purpose. You have to have a reason for getting out of bed, and you have to have a reason for coming through the gate in the morning to your place of work. And you're impoverished if you don't have that. And along that journey of knowing why you're doing it, you have to have beacons that guide you. There are not a moral purpose, but a moral compass. And those things need to guide you. So, you know, what I then go on to talk about is, have you come across Ubuntu?
Yes, indeed. In
Ubuntu.
Africa.
in
Yes.
South Africa. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's just a beautiful. I just love saying the word Ubuntu. And Desmond Tutu, he defined it as "I am because you are." You know, that notion that we can't live separately, we can't live in conflict. You know, there is such a thing called love. You know, that I don't know if you've ever heard Andrew Curran speak. Andrew is a consultant neurologist. He does a very technical talk about the brain and all the different aspects of it and what each part does and so on. But at the end, he said the one thing that this unique organ thrives on, and he writes across the screen, love. You know, that's that kind of sense of togetherness. And another one is Ohana. I came across that in Disney, actually, you know, in Lilo and Stitch, the Disney movie. Um, and it was the film crew who made it, who made the film. They said the guy who drove them around, they were filming it in Hawaii, or it was based in Hawaii. And they, um, they actually were amazed that the guy who drove them around knew everybody. Wherever they went, he knew everybody. And and they said, "How come you know everybody?" And he said, "Ohana." He said, "We are all a family." And and what the South Africans will say, or the Africans will say, and that what binds us is Ubuntu. So it's Ohana is togetherness and trust, and Ubuntu is I am because we are. Um, and I suppose I couldn't leave this without saying another muse that guides me on that beacon, if you like, on the moral road is Sisu. Um, the Finns invented it. We don't really have a word for Sisu. We try. I think grit is the nearest you get to it. But what I was talking to Pazzi Salberg, who's a great guy. You've probably worked with Pazzi. I mean, he was the brains. Well, he was the education minister, wasn't he, in
Yeah.
Finland when they were top of the world league tables, you know. And he said there were a couple of words that we don't have a word. They don't even have a word for accountability, you know, in Finland. Isn't that amazing? And I said, well, what do you have? He said, professional trust. You know, I'll educate you, I'll train you, I'll resource you, I'll give you the powers, and then you get on with it. And I don't need to keep coming back to test you and then stick you on the front of the newspaper if you failed. He said that's where Thatcher went wrong. He said that public accountability, he said, doesn't work. But the other word he said is sisu, and sisu is quiet relentlessness.
Mm.
The people who just get on with it and they just don't give up. But
Wow.
so that's what values are to me. And I mean, our family motto is aim high, work hard, be kind, no excuses. And I
Wow.
suppose that will probably be on my gravestone.
Well, I hope that doesn't come too soon, John. Because you said earlier that you're a golfer.
Yeah.
Tell listeners what you said to me about the Friday afternooners. You've got a name for yourselves,
Oh,
haven't
the
you?
coffin dodgers. Yeah.
The coffin dodgers. Well, I hope we both dodge it a bit
God's
longer anyway.
waiting room. Yeah, there we are.
So, John Jones, this has been the most fascinating of noble conversations with you. I'm sure listeners have been fascinated listening to you, and I'm sure they're going to tell their friends to listen to you as well. Personally, I've learned so much. The depth of insights that have formed your life are incredible. I think it's inspiring to listen to you so that people can find their own meaning and purpose in life. Before we finish, John, is there a last word you would like to say to listeners?
I want to say it to you, really, Neil, and that is, you know, when you said about the future of education, the future of education is values based education. It is, and yet there are still so few of you, us, flying that flag. So power to your elbow, mate. You know, we can't, but I don't think there's been a better time now. I think people are beginning to realize, and
Mm.
there are strange things going on in the world at the moment. And what one, I mean, I listened to Mark Carney speak the other night. He's the Prime Minister of Canada,
That's right.
and it was at the core of what he was saying was values.
Mm.
And there's now that standard has been placed in the ground, and you placed that standard in the ground a long time ago, and there are more and more people now gathering around it. So well done.
Thank you. What pleases me, John, is that people are beginning not just to talk about values and argue about them, but to actually do something about things. Living the values is the most important thing, and that's why I'm getting people to think about in businesses and everything. And may I thank you for your support as a key patron of all the work that we do. We are making progress, but we need to make an even bigger impact. And that's what I'm determined to do as long as I don't get in that coffin that you talked about too soon.
Yeah, well,
Um,
you see, I tell you what, you represent to me. You're not just bothered, you're deliberately bothered.
yeah,
And
I,
that's a very different type of botheredness, isn't it?
mm, mm. I
And
think
let's have a beer soon.
I hope so, John. Thank you ever so much for talking with me today on our noble conversation. And and I hope we'll be speaking soon. And
Anytime.
listeners, I hope you've enjoyed, well, I know you've enjoyed this conversation. I hope you will join me at a future time. And also, I think this is the 18th Noble Conversation, so you can look through the library to listen to the other great speakers too. So, thank you all very much. I'm now going to attempt to stop the recording. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye. Goodbye,
Goodbye.
John.
Bye bye.